They were starving, exhausted, and outnumbered 3-1. In front of them, thousands of heavily armored French knights. It looked like a massacre waiting to happen. But just hours later, those proud knights lay lifeless in the mud. What happened at Agincourt? And how did the English turn certain defeat into legendary victory? The year was 1415. Europe was scarred by decades of war between England and France, a struggle known as the 100 Years' War. Though both kingdoms were weary, ambition still burned. In England, a young and determined king had risen to the throne, Henry V. He was only 28 years old, but already he had cast aside the reckless days of youth. Now, he was a warrior king, his eyes fixed on France. Henry claimed the French crown through his ancestry, a claim the French rejected. To enforce it, he gathered an army and crossed the Channel. His campaign began with the brutal siege of Harfleur, where disease, hunger, and French resistance bled the English army dry. By the time the port city fell, Henry had lost nearly a third of his men, not to battle, but to dysentery and exhaustion. Still, he pressed on. With only around 6,000 soldiers, many of them longbowmen, Henry marched north toward Calais, hoping to reach English territory. But the French would not allow him to escape so easily. In France, nobles rallied to defend their land. Proud knights clad in glittering armor, banners streaming in the autumn wind, gathered in vast numbers. Estimates spoke of 20,000 or more, 3 times the size of Henry's weary host. Their confidence was absolute. To them, the English were already defeated, sick, starving, and trapped deep in hostile territory. On October 24, the two armies finally came face to face near the village of Agincourt. Rain fell heavy, turning the fields into thick mud. The French, with their cavalry and knights, saw it as a mere inconvenience. The English, tired and outnumbered, saw it as both curse and blessing. That night, Henry walked among his men, speaking softly. He told them not of numbers, but of destiny. "We few shall show the world," he said, "that courage weighs heavier than gold." As dawn approached, the English sharpened their stakes, strung their longbows, and steadied their hearts. Across the field, the French knights laughed and boasted of the ransom they would collect from these tired islanders. Neither side knew that by the end of the next day, the muddy fields of Agincourt would be soaked with French blood, and Henry's name would be carved forever into history. Morning broke cold and grey over the fields of Agincourt. Mist clung to the low ground, and the earth was sodden with rain from the night before. The once ploughed farmland had turned into a mire of thick, sucking mud. For the English, it was a shield. For the French, who relied upon the charge of heavy cavalry and armored knights, it was a curse waiting to be revealed. Henry V arrayed his army with care. At the center stood his weary men-at-arms, dismounted knights and nobles of England, flanked on either side by longbowmen. These archers, hardened veterans of countless skirmishes, carried the weapon that would decide the day, the English longbow. Each archer carried a bundle of arrows and stood behind sharpened stakes hammered into the ground, deadly obstacles meant to repel charging horses. Across the field, the French deployed in grand splendor. Their numbers dwarfed the English, 3 men for every one Henry commanded. The cream of French nobility was present, dukes, counts, and knights glittering in polished plate, their banners bright against the morning mist. They arranged themselves in 3 massive divisions. At the front, thousands of heavily armored men-at-arms stood ready to march forward, certain of victory. Behind them waited reserves of cavalry, eager to smash through once the English line broke. Confidence filled the French camp. Knights laughed about the ransom they would demand for Henry himself, some even gambling over which noble would claim the English king as prisoner. To them, the outcome was not in doubt, it was only a matter of how much wealth and glory they would reap. But the English stood in silence. Mud clung to their boots, hunger gnawed at their bellies, but their eyes were steady. They knew the stakes: to surrender meant chains, to lose meant death. There was no retreat. Henry rode along the line, his armor plain compared to the finery of the French. Raising his voice so all could hear, he declared, "Brothers, we are not many. But those who fight today will be remembered as long as England stands. And though they outnumber us, they cannot outmatch our courage." His words settled like fire in the men's hearts. Archers gripped their bows tighter, knights raised their swords in salute. The French banners rippled, horns sounded in the mist. The first wave prepared to advance. The Battle of Agincourt was about to begin. The French vanguard surged forward with confidence, their armor gleaming beneath the grey skies. Thousands of knights and men-at-arms advanced across the field, their banners fluttering proudly. Yet with every step, the mud clung to them, dragging at their legs, sucking at the hooves of their horses. Progress was slower than they expected, but pride kept them moving. On the English side, silence reigned. The archers stood like statues, bows strung, arrows ready, their sharpened stakes forming a bristling wall. They waited for the order, eyes fixed on the approaching tide of steel. Henry raised his hand. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sweeping motion, he gave the command. 1,000 bowstrings sang as one. The sky darkened with arrows, a deadly storm hissing through the mist. The first volley struck the French like hammer blows, shafts piercing through visors, joints, and unprotected gaps in armor. Horses screamed and collapsed, knights toppled into the mud, banners faltered. Still, the French pressed on, shields raised, shouting their war cries. But volley after volley fell, relentless, merciless. The longbows could be loosed 6 times in a minute, and each arrow carried the weight of death. The vanguard began to stumble, not from lack of courage, but from the sheer punishment raining down upon them. Some knights tried to spur their horses into a charge, hoping to smash through the stakes and silence the archers. But the mud betrayed them. Horses sank, floundering, their riders thrown into the muck, helpless beneath the storm of arrows. Those who reached the English line were met with steel and fury. Archers drew hatchets, knives, and mallets, cutting down knights as they struggled to rise from the mud. Henry's men-at-arms stood firm in the center, braced for impact, while the archers, freed from their bows, waded into the melee like wolves among fallen prey. The pride of French nobility, armored in the finest steel, was trapped in the earth like insects in tar. Their numbers worked against them, crushing each other in the press, while the English cut them down without mercy. The field of Agincourt had become a slaughterhouse. The French advance, meant to crush the English in a single sweep, had turned into chaos. The first line of knights, heavy with armor, stumbled into the mire, slowed to a crawl. Those behind, urged on by pride and the deafening sound of horns, pressed forward blindly, only to find their comrades collapsing before them. The ranks jammed tighter and tighter, men-at-arms packed shoulder to shoulder, unable to lift their swords properly in the suffocating crush. From the English line, the archers unleashed volley after volley until their arrows were nearly spent. Then, with grim determination, they dropped their bows, seized their short swords, axes, and mallets, and charged into the floundering French. It was butchery. Knights, trapped in the mud and the press of their own men, could not raise their arms to strike. Many fell face first into the muck, drowning under the weight of their armor. Others, dragged down by archers, were beaten to death with mallets meant for driving stakes. The finest nobility of France, men who had ridden with banners and trumpets, now flailed helplessly in the mud, cut down by peasants in leather jerkins. Henry V himself fought in the melee, his presence a beacon to his men. More than once he was targeted by French knights eager to seize him for ransom. At one point, a powerful blow from an axe struck his helmet, nearly killing him, but he rose again, blood streaming, roaring for his men to hold firm. His courage stiffened their resolve. Behind the chaos, the second French line hesitated. They watched as their comrades ahead were crushed in the mire, slaughtered before they could even reach the English formation. Yet pride and shame drove them forward at last. They surged into the press, adding their weight to the disaster, piling bodies upon bodies until the mud itself seemed to devour them. By midday, the battlefield was a grotesque sea of armored corpses. Thousands of French nobles lay dead or dying, suffocated beneath their fellows or butchered by English hands. And still, Henry's exhausted but unbroken host stood firm, their cries of victory rising over the groans of the fallen. The miracle of Agincourt was unfolding. The battlefield of Agincourt had become a nightmare. What had begun as a proud advance of French nobility now dissolved into horror. The mud was thick with blood, and the cries of trapped knights echoed like the groans of drowning men. The French had believed their numbers would bring swift victory, but the crowded field betrayed them. Knights fell, unable to rise beneath the weight of their own armor. Horses collapsed, their riders trampled by comrades pressing forward from behind. The more men surged into the killing ground, the worse the disaster became. On the English side, Henry's men fought with ruthless efficiency. Archers who had once loosed arrows now waded into the melee, their mallets and daggers striking with brutal precision. They targeted visor slits, the joints of plate armor, the weak spots every soldier of the longbow knew by heart. Where the French knights saw themselves as lions, the English treated them like trapped game. Henry V remained in the thick of it. His voice rang above the din, rallying his men. Stand fast. They falter, press them down. At one desperate moment, the French nearly broke through. A group of knights charged directly at the English king, determined to seize or kill him. Henry fought fiercely, his sword flashing in the mud and blood. He was knocked down, dragged up again, his standard-bearer slain beside him. But his men closed ranks, cutting down the attackers, and Henry survived to fight on. His very survival felt like a miracle, strengthening the resolve of his weary army. The French second wave tried to press forward but found only carnage. Their comrades lay in heaps, the ground itself a grave. Many hesitated, unwilling to throw themselves into the slaughter. Their commanders, driven by pride, pushed them on, but hesitation had already curdled into fear. By mid-afternoon, the French army was collapsing. Thousands of its finest knights lay dead, the nobility of France cut down in droves. What had been expected as a triumph had turned into humiliation. For Henry, each passing hour turned despair into glory. Outnumbered 3-1, his band of brothers still stood, unbroken, as the flower of French chivalry drowned in the mud before them. The miracle was becoming legend. By late afternoon, the French army was broken, though not yet routed. Small groups of knights still fought desperately, hacking at the English lines in acts of doomed defiance. But the great surges of organized attack were gone, reduced to chaos, despair, and slaughter. The English, though exhausted, pressed their advantage. Archers swarmed over the field, finishing the wounded with knives, stripping armor from the fallen to reuse or sell. Men-at-arms fought with grim determination, each blow driving the French deeper into panic. The muddy ground was so thick with bodies that soldiers stumbled over corpses as much as earth. Henry V stood amidst it all, spattered in mud and blood, his armor dented, his face streaked but resolute. His very presence seemed to carry divine favor. Wherever he appeared, his soldiers rallied, shouting with fresh courage. To the English, their king was no longer a man but a figure anointed by heaven itself. Yet in the midst of victory came sudden danger. From the rear, word spread of a mounted French force striking at the English baggage train, where prisoners and supplies were guarded. Panic rippled through Henry's ranks. If the French could regroup, the battle might yet turn. Henry acted swiftly, his voice like steel. Kill the prisoners. Kill them all. The order shocked even his own men. Among the captives were some of France's highest nobility, worth vast ransoms. But Henry's command was absolute. The risk of prisoners rearming or being rescued outweighed treasure. Reluctantly, his soldiers began cutting down the captives, filling the air with fresh screams. It was a brutal reminder that this was no tournament of chivalry, but a war for survival. The French raiding party was driven off, but the massacre of prisoners remained a dark stain upon the day. Still, Henry's decisiveness preserved his fragile army from collapse. By sunset, the French were shattered. Their banners lay trampled in the mud, their nobles slain in staggering numbers. England's weary host stood victorious against impossible odds. On the fields of Agincourt, the flower of French chivalry lay in ruin. When the clash of steel faded and the last shouts died away, silence fell upon Agincourt, broken only by the groans of the dying. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Thousands of French knights and men-at-arms lay heaped together, suffocated in the press, drowned in mud, or slain by English hands. Horses sprawled lifeless, banners sagged into the mire, and the autumn rain washed crimson streams across the furrows of the fields. For the English, victory brought little joy at first. They were too weary, too battered, too shocked by what they had endured. Archers leaned on their bows, men-at-arms slumped against their shields, their breath steaming in the chill air. They had fought outnumbered 3-1, expecting death, and lived. The miracle had left them stunned. Henry V walked among his men, his armor dented, his surcoat torn, yet his posture tall. He paused to clasp shoulders, to thank soldiers by name, to remind them that they had achieved the impossible. God has judged us this day, he declared. Not by numbers, but by righteousness. His words steadied the men, turning their exhaustion into pride. The French, meanwhile, lay broken. Among the dead were the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Brabant, and countless nobles whose names had once carried fear across Europe. Captured too were the Duke of Orleans and Jean Lemanger, the Marshal of France. The flower of French chivalry, knights bred for war, had been scythed down by farmers with bows and men fighting for survival. The field was stripped as night fell. Armor, weapons, even the boots of the dead were scavenged. Fires crackled as the English warmed themselves, their laughter tentative at first, then swelling as the enormity of their victory sank in. Across the valley, French survivors slunk away, carrying with them the bitter truth, their pride had drowned in the mud. Agincourt was no mere battle. It was a reckoning. Dawn rose over Agincourt with a heavy mist, veiling the horrors of the previous day. As the haze lifted, the full scale of the slaughter became clear. The field stretched endlessly with corpses, the nobility of France piled in mud and blood, their armor dulled, their banners trampled. It was said that nearly 6,000 Frenchmen lay dead, most of them knights and men-at-arms, the very backbone of French chivalry. The English survivors, barely more than 6,000 men at the start of the battle, now far fewer after days of hunger, disease, and combat, staggered in disbelief at what they had done. Some whispered that heaven itself must have bent the storm and mud to their favor. Others simply muttered that they were alive by miracle. Henry V gathered his men in prayer. Bareheaded, he knelt upon the sodden earth, giving thanks to God before all. He did not boast of his generalship, nor of his archers, but declared, "Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give the glory." Yet even in triumph, Henry bore the weight of his terrible choices. The killing of prisoners still haunted his ranks, murmurs of unease drifting through the camp. But Henry was resolute. Better a hard king than a broken kingdom, he told his captains. To him, survival outweighed honor. Meanwhile, across France, the news fell like thunder. The nobility had been destroyed in a single day, fathers and sons cut down together, dynasties left without heirs. Grief swept through castles and villages alike. France was stunned not only by the loss, but by the humiliation. The proud knights of Christendom had been undone by mud, arrows, and hunger. For England, the victory became legend. Word raced across the Channel, greeted by bells and feasts. To the people, Henry was no longer just a king, he was God's chosen, a warrior who had proven that faith and discipline could humble giants. But for Henry himself, Agincourt was not an end. It was a beginning. With France broken, the crown of both kingdoms no longer seemed an impossible dream. The blood of Agincourt paved his road to glory. The story of Agincourt spread like wildfire across Europe. Messengers carried the news over rivers and mountains, and wherever it was told, disbelief followed. How could 6,000 starving, sick, and exhausted Englishmen crush a host 3 times their size? How could the nobility of France, the very flower of chivalry, fall to common archers wielding longbows? In France, the shock was devastating. Noble houses mourned sons and fathers lost together in the mud. The pride of French knighthood had been drowned at Agincourt, leaving scars not just on the battlefield but on the very soul of the kingdom. The Dauphin himself was left shaken, his councillors divided and desperate to rebuild. For years to come, French nobles would whisper of that day with bitterness, some blaming rashness, others blaming fate. In England, it was triumph beyond measure. Church bells rang from London to York, chroniclers proclaimed that God himself had fought beside Henry, and the common folk sang songs of victory. For the archers and men-at-arms who returned home, they were hailed as heroes. Henry's reputation soared, no longer just a king, but a warrior anointed. Even beyond these kingdoms, Agincourt became legend. Italian merchants marveled at tales of knights suffocated in mud, German princes pondered the strength of discipline over pride, and the papacy itself took note of Henry's rising power. The myth of chivalry, the belief that knights in shining armor were the masters of war, was shattered. In its place rose a new truth, that skill, planning, and the weapons of the common man could change the fate of nations. For Henry, the victory was more than survival, it was a step toward destiny. With France crippled, his claim to its crown seemed no longer folly but attainable. He pressed his advantage in the years that followed, striking deeper into French lands, his name a shadow over every court in Europe. Yet Agincourt remained the jewel of his legend. A day when the impossible had been done, when a king and a small band of weary men defied an empire and won. And in every telling, the muddy fields of northern France grew into holy ground, sanctified by courage, blood, and miracle. In the quiet after the storm, the field of Agincourt stood as both graveyard and monument. Where once knights had boasted of glory, only silence remained. The mud was thick with broken lances, shattered helms, and the lifeless forms of France's proudest nobles. Yet among the living, another memory began to take shape, not of despair, but of immortality. Henry V knew it. Standing before his weary men, he spoke not of spoils nor of ransom, but of the bond forged in blood. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," he declared, not as a king to subjects, but as one soldier to another. In that moment, every archer, every man-at-arms, every knight felt they had become part of something greater than themselves. The legend of Agincourt was born there, in the mud, in the hunger, in the defiance of impossible odds. It was not merely an English victory. It was proof that destiny could be seized by courage, that steel alone was not enough without discipline, and that kings could stand shoulder to shoulder with common men. Across Europe, the tale endured. Chroniclers wrote of the miraculous triumph, poets wove it into verse, and generations of soldiers drew strength from it. For France, Agincourt remained a wound, an emblem of arrogance undone. For England, it became scripture, a story of faith and valor that outlived Henry himself. And though Henry would march on, securing treaties and crowns, his glory was forever tied to that autumn day in 1415, when 6,000 weary men defied a giant and prevailed. The fields of Agincourt, still quiet beneath the northern sky, hold no monuments of stone, yet they whisper to history. They whisper of the mud that swallowed pride, of arrows that fell like rain, of a king who fought among his men, and of a band of brothers whose names are lost but whose courage is eternal. For on that day, outnumbered and outmatched, they proved that valor can carve miracles into the earth, and that some victories echo forever.